Lucy stood in the courtroom, her hands trembling, eyes fixed on the man she once called father. Her voice steady, but every word carried years of silent suffering. The room was silent, the truth echoing. Aaron, the perfect father, was now exposed. But just when it seemed over, Lucy's confession took an unexpected turn. But what happened next? Even the judge couldn't believe it. But let's start from the beginning. The courtroom was suffocating with tension as Lucy, a 16-year-old girl, stood to face her father, Aaron. The weight of the moment pressed down on her, her hands trembling as she took a step forward. Her father, once her hero, the one she had trusted unconditionally, now stood across from her as the accused. The crowd fell into a heavy silence. Lucy's resolve, however, was unshakable. Her heart raced as she began to speak, her voice breaking through the stillness. For years, she had hidden the bruises, the fear, the unspoken terror that lurked in their home. She had been terrified of him, terrified of the man who had once cradled her in his arms, now turned stranger. But she could no longer be silent. His abuse had escalated, consuming everything around her, and with every act of cruelty, she had silently prepared herself for this moment. As she spoke, the room remained eerily quiet. The weight of Lucy's words was undeniable, every sentence slicing through the facade of her father's innocence. Her gaze was unwavering, fixed on Aaron, but inside, her thoughts swirled with memories of all the times he had hurt her, both physically and emotionally. The pain in her voice was raw, stripped of the years of fear that had silenced her. Yet, despite it all, she spoke with a clarity and courage that left no room for doubt. Lucy's words unfolded slowly, methodically. Each recollection of abuse was like a small piece of a shattered puzzle, revealing the man her father had become. The audience could feel her torment, her struggle, as she described what had once been her world, a world now tarnished by manipulation, control, and fear. She was no longer the frightened child who had looked up to him. She had become the voice of truth, and that truth was more powerful than any fear. The judge, a seasoned woman known for her dedication to protecting the vulnerable, observed Lucy intently. Her eyes never wavered, understanding the weight of what was being said. She had seen many cases, but this one felt different, more personal, more heartbreaking. The entire courtroom hung on Lucy's every word, as if they could not believe what they were hearing. How could such a man, such a well-respected figure, have concealed his monstrous side for so long? The courtroom was filled with disbelief. Aaron, the man who had once been the pillar of their community, the one everyone thought they knew, now stood as the villain. His face remained cold, his eyes locked on Lucy with an emotionless stare. There was no remorse, no admission, just silence, as if the man she once loved had become nothing more than a stranger. Lucy's confession echoed through the room like a cry for help that had finally been answered. Her pain, now laid bare before everyone, was impossible to ignore. But as she spoke, something shifted. Her words were no longer just about the past. They were about reclaiming her future. She was no longer bound by the fear he had imposed on her. She was free, finally, to speak her truth. The silence in the room was deafening. The air was thick with emotion, the kind that made it hard to breathe. Lucy had just shattered the illusion of a perfect family, exposing the darkness that had been lurking beneath the surface. It was a confession that no one expected, a revelation that no one was prepared for. And yet, in the midst of all that pain, there was something else, something that defied the cruelty of Aaron's actions. Hope. The trial dragged on, and with each passing day, the walls of deception that Aaron had so carefully constructed began to crumble. Lucy, once the quiet, trembling girl, now stood in the spotlight, unwavering in her resolve. Her voice, though still marked by emotion, carried the weight of truth, an undeniable strength that stunned everyone in the courtroom. Each piece of evidence she presented seemed to chip away at the father they all thought they knew. The defense lawyer tried to discredit her at every turn. He sneered, questioning her credibility, calling into doubt the details of her memories, trying to twist her pain into something unworthy of belief. But Lucy, standing firm, refused to falter. She no longer shrank from his accusations. Instead, she held her ground. Her gaze never left Aaron, whose mask of control was beginning to crack. The room could feel the intensity of her focus, as though Lucy had tapped into a hidden well of power, the strength of someone who had endured the unthinkable and was now determined to make it known. The prosecution, relentless and thorough, brought forth old records, documents, testimonies, photographs, all meticulously compiled to uncover the truth that Aaron had hidden for years. Each new revelation exposed another layer of his deceit, another instance of his cruelty. The audience shifted in their seats as they learned the depth of the darkness Aaron had concealed behind his facade. He had manipulated everyone, twisted their perceptions with his charm, using his image as a respectable father to control those around him. The air in the courtroom thickened with a palpable sense of disgust as Aaron's carefully constructed identity began to unravel. And yet, despite the mounting evidence, Aaron maintained his composure. His cold, calculated demeanor remained unchanged. He leaned forward in his chair, hands clasped, as if he could still convince everyone that he was a loving father, a man of integrity. His eyes, however, betrayed him. They darted nervously when confronted with the evidence, but he quickly regained his mask. It was as if he truly believed that he could still control the narrative, that he could somehow convince the court to see him as the man he pretended to be. But the truth was out now, and no amount of charm could hide it. Lucy's emotional battle intensified. The courtroom could feel her frustration, her exhaustion, as she continued to push forward. The weight of every accusation, every painful memory she recounted, threatened to break her. But she would not give in. She could no longer stay silent, could no longer let him manipulate the world around her. With each word, she peeled back another layer of the lie he had lived, and with each layer, the courtroom's disbelief turned into anger. Anger toward a man who had betrayed his own family, who had used his power to silence the voices of those who were supposed to trust him the most. Then came the moment that no one expected. Lucy's mother, once the silent observer, stood to testify. The woman who had lived in the shadows of Aaron's control, who had been too afraid to speak out, now found her voice. Her voice trembled as she recounted her own experiences, the years of fear and manipulation that had kept her quiet. The room shifted. The audience, once in shock, now felt a rising sense of outrage. It was not just Lucy's suffering that had been ignored. It was her mother's, too. Her testimony confirmed what had once seemed impossible, that the abuse was not only happening to Lucy, but had been a silent, insidious force in their home for years. The courtroom, already filled with disbelief, now buzzed with frustration. How had it taken so long for the truth to surface? How had this man, the one who had once been the face of their community, the man everyone admired, managed to hide his darkness for so long? The anger was palpable, not just for the victims, but for everyone who had been deceived by Aaron's manipulation. For years, they had all been complicit in allowing him to hide behind his carefully constructed facade. But now, there was no more room for lies. The truth had found its voice, and it would not be silenced. The courtroom was thick with anticipation as the trial reached its peak. Every eye in the room was fixed on the father and daughter, the tension so heavy it seemed to choke the air. Lucy, exhausted but resolute, stood facing her father for the final time. This was the moment, the last chance for truth to break through, for justice to be served. The prosecutor's voice rang out, demanding accountability for the years of suffering Lucy had endured at the hands of her father, Aaron. Aaron, the man who had once been her protector, now tried desperately to cling to the role of the victim. He shifted in his seat, his face contorting with frustration as the room's focus turned entirely to him. In a sudden outburst, he tried to deflect the charges, accusing Lucy of exaggerating, of misunderstanding, of being manipulated by others. He pointed at the jury, his eyes cold and calculating, attempting to turn the tables as he had so many times before. The practiced charm he had relied on for years was on full display, but it was too late. His attempts to sway the room fell flat. Lucy, standing just feet away from the man who had torn apart her world, finally found the courage to speak. Her voice, shaking with emotion, cut through the courtroom like a knife. "I'm not afraid of you anymore," she screamed, her words reverberating off the walls. For a moment the room fell silent, as if the very air had been sucked from it. Lucy's words hung in the air, her defiance a sharp contrast to the terror that had once ruled her life. Aaron recoiled, stunned by her outburst. His face tightened with anger, his facade of control slipping further. But Lucy didn't flinch. She stood tall, her body trembling but unwavering. No longer was she the frightened child she had been when she first entered the courtroom. In this moment she was no longer just a victim. She had become something far more powerful, an embodiment of courage, an unstoppable force. Her raw emotions surged, flooding the room, leaving the jury, the audience, and even the judge in stunned silence. This was the turning point, the final unraveling of the man who had spent years concealing his true nature. Lucy's voice, trembling with years of pent-up pain, finally broke the silence. Every word she spoke carried the weight of a lifetime of suffering. "You took everything from me," she said, her voice now steady and unyielding. "But you will not take my voice. Not anymore." The power in those words was undeniable. For the first time, Lucy was no longer trapped in the shadow of her father. The fear that had once crippled her was gone, replaced by a clarity of purpose. The room was still, each person in that courtroom feeling the magnitude of the moment. The vulnerability in her voice was raw, but it held an unexpected strength. Lucy was no longer hiding behind the facade of a frightened child. She was standing in her own truth, and it was a truth that could not be ignored. The audience, once quiet and reserved, shifted in their seats, the collective weight of their gaze on Aaron growing heavier with each passing second. It was as though they were seeing him for the first time. Not the charming, respectable man he had always pretended to be, but the abuser who had manipulated everyone, including his own daughter. In this moment, the entire dynamic shifted. Lucy had taken control. The courtroom, once filled with doubt, now seemed to pulse with the electricity of something new. Hope. Hope that this moment could be the end of Aaron's reign of terror, that the truth could finally rise to the surface. The audience felt it, the slow, dawning realization that everything was about to change. Lucy's transformation from victim to victor was complete. Her words had done what evidence alone could not. She had exposed the depth of her father's cruelty, and in doing so, she had reclaimed her life. The courtroom was no longer just a place of judgment. It had become the stage for her rebirth. As she stood there, unwavering, a sense of justice and possibility began to take root in the hearts of those who witnessed it. The fight wasn't over, but it was a fight Lucy was no longer afraid to face. The jury deliberated for what felt like an eternity. Time seemed to stretch out, each minute more excruciating than the last. Lucy sat in her seat, her hands clenched tightly together, eyes fixed on the front of the courtroom. Her mind raced, replaying every moment of the trial, the fear, the pain, the courage she had summoned to stand up to her father. And now, It was all in the hands of 12 strangers who had seen her truth. She had given everything for this moment. Her body trembled from exhaustion, but her heart was resolute. What would the jury say? What would happen to the man who had torn her life apart? The seconds dragged on, each one a weight on her shoulders. The courtroom, which had been so charged with tension during the trial, now felt suffocating with silence. Every spectator was waiting. Then, after what seemed like an eternity, the door to the deliberation room opened. The foreman stepped forward, his eyes scanning the room before locking with Lucy's. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Aaron Mitchell, guilty on all charges." The words hung in the air, sharp and final. It was a moment frozen in time, a moment that Lucy had dreamed of but never truly believed would come. For a heartbeat, the world seemed to stop. Lucy's chest tightened, and the reality of what had just happened hit her like a wave. She had won. Justice had been served. The man who had controlled her life with fear and lies was now exposed for who he truly was. A wave of emotion swept through her, her hands trembling as tears welled up in her eyes. But they were not tears of sorrow, not the tears of a girl trapped in a nightmare. These were tears of relief, tears that had been held back for years, tears that had finally found their release. She blinked rapidly, trying to hold them in, but they spilled over, a silent testament to the years of pain, the years of silence. Her mother, who had been seated beside her, reached out and wrapped her arms around Lucy. The embrace was tight, warm, and full of the love that had been hidden behind years of fear. The courtroom around them seemed to disappear as Lucy buried her face in her mother's shoulder. This was the moment they had both waited for, the moment that would change everything. The applause erupted in the courtroom, echoing off the walls. It was as if the entire room, all the witnesses, all the people who had been following this case, were finally breathing again. Justice had been served. But for Lucy, the applause was not what mattered most. It was the feel of her mother's arms around her, the realization that they were no longer prisoners of the past. They were free. The final scenes of the story took place outside the courthouse. Lucy and her mother walked side by side, the sunlight shining brightly as they stepped onto the steps of the building. The weight of the past seemed to lift with each step they took. The sound of their footsteps was steady and strong, a symbol of the new life they were beginning to build. Lucy's face, once marked by fear and uncertainty, now radiated a quiet strength. There was still a long road ahead, still much to heal. But in that moment, she felt something she hadn't felt in years. Hope. The woman who had once been a scared teenager, trapped in the silence of abuse, had been transformed into a warrior of truth. She had fought and won, not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever been silenced by fear. The final shot lingered on Lucy as she stood outside a women's shelter, the sun setting behind her. She was volunteering, helping other women who had faced the same darkness she had. Her face was calm, her eyes steady, and there was a quiet pride in the way she carried herself. She had found her voice. She had found her purpose. The screen faded to black, and the final words appeared, simple but powerful. The truth always finds a way to be heard. The message was clear. No matter how deep the darkness may seem, the truth will always rise, and with it, the power to overcome anything.